C.S. Lewis is a famous author, as many of you know. Maybe you were like me and you read the Chronicles of Narnia growing up. And maybe, as I hope to do, perhaps you've read them again, this time to your children or grandchildren. There's The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, to name but one. C.S. Lewis has a prolific career. He also wrote a book called The Screwtape Letters, which maybe you read that too at some point, although unlikely to your children, because the short book records the correspondence between a senior mentor-level demon and some sort of entry-level deity entity. My college, out in Spokane, Washington, had a January term class taught by one of my philosophy professors. It was taught on C.S. Lewis. And soon thereafter, come the spring semester, everybody who took that class wanted to put a copy of Screwtape into your hands. I never took the class. I never read more than a few pages. Because outside of Narnia, I am categorically not a C.S. Lewis guy. An especially zealous religion major found this out maybe the hard way. He took it upon himself to grill me. Why I wasn't taking Lewis, which is what they called it. Why aren't you taking Lewis in January? So I told him, I said, listen, man, if C.S. Lewis wrote it and there's no talking lion, then I ain't going to read it. He looked at me confused and said, are you even a religion major? I loathed reading C.S. Lewis when I had to. I wasn't going to do it recreationally. I'm still not planning to. But I did learn something this week about his life. C.S. Lewis lost his wife after only 4 years of marriage. He had married a poet named Joy Davidman, and in the last chapter of her life, she suffered mightily as cancer metastasized in her bones. Lewis and Davidman had been married a short 4 years, and now he was called upon to bury his beloved wife. Writers write, and so that's what C.S. Lewis did. He processed in pen and paper. He kept notebooks where he gave word to his anger, where he described his grief. Writers write and publishers publish. And so these notebooks became a book. It's entitled A Grief Observed, and it was published under a pseudonym, N.W. Clerk, so that Lewis's raw grief and loss would not have to carry the weight of Narnia and everything that came before. You can find this book now. You'll find it to be candid and raw. C.S. Lewis's anger, he's bewildered. And the part of the book that I discovered as I worked towards this Sunday, All Saints Sunday, was that for Lewis, his grief so very often feels like fear. C.S. Lewis is the author of brave and unlikely characters. They face their fears as they reconcile their own sense of inadequacy. But in the pages of Grief Observed, now C.S. Lewis is the one afraid. And who can blame him? His world has changed. His life upended. His love gone. His heart rent in two. For Lewis, grief so very often feels like fear. You could say the same for our scripture. Elijah, the prophet's grief has made him deeply afraid. You know, the prophet wasn't always grieving, not at all. Not always afraid, not always running for his life. Atop Mount Carmel, just the chapter previous, the prophet knew great triumph. But we skip those chapters to land here today. Now Elijah invokes the God of Israel, not to call down a raging fire, but perhaps to give him a sense of purpose and peace. Previously, Elijah called down fire and shamed the prophets of Baal, shamed their idolatrous God. And yet, at that very triumph, that very pinnacle of the story, Mount Carmel, where he finds himself, is a double-edged sword. The prophets of Baal, even the god Baal, not even a spark when the God of Israel was an all-consuming inferno. But there atop Mount Carmel, this triumph of Elijah cuts both ways. God's victory now requires the prophet's escape. In order to preserve his life from these memorable bad guys that you know, Jezebel and Ahab, Elijah flees Mount Carmel without even a moment to prepare for what we're told is 40 days spent journeying from one holy mountain to the other. 40 days to reach Mount Horeb. Even our texts call it God's mountain. Mount Horeb may sound familiar. It's where God took up residence, where God gave Moses the Ten Commandments. Horeb is where the Hebrews of Exodus came to find God first dwelling among them. And so in chapter 19, we meet up with Elijah here atop Mount Horeb. The God Elijah invoked on top of one mountain now asks the prophet why he's on this one. What are you doing here, Elijah? God asks. I have searched, says the prophet. I have understood. I have known this call as a blessing, and yet now I am alone. And to my ears, the prophet sounds very much like C.S. Lewis in his reply. The prophet has lost his understanding of call. Elijah has no certainty in his purpose. Elijah is hunted. His world is turned upside down. Elijah is grieving. Elijah is afraid. Atop God's mountain, it's 40 days away, and the prophet's loss absolutely terrifies him. Elijah sounds as equally surprised as Lewis did, finding himself now afraid. All Saints Sunday, and those we honor today, will ring a chime in the speaking of their name, our annual celebration yearly, God's claim upon their death, the insistence that death no longer knows victory. We too find ourselves atop God's mountain. Climbing this mountain with Elijah, it does not any sort of take a leap of imagination. It does not take the speaking of your beloved's name to be here atop this mountain with Elijah, where we recognize that every loss indeed changes the world. C.S. Lewis lost his beloved. Elijah has lost his certainty. Both the world that they knew has changed. Both of them find it terrifying. Perhaps you know the feeling. I wonder what Elijah thought was going to happen atop Mount Horeb. 40 days running from Carmel, from them seeking him. Along the way, he's ministered by angels, but no one tells him to go to Mount Horeb. So why go there? What did he think was going to take place once he arrived atop this second mountain? What were his hopes? Why this one over others? Scripture doesn't say, but perhaps with so much taken away now, with such acute fears for an unknown future, perhaps Elijah travels to Horeb so that he might perchance hear the voice of the one capable of keeping and making promises. Moses heard God's voice atop Mount Horeb. Maybe Elijah's there for the same reason. I had a professor of mine who called the passages here the most beautiful in all of Scripture. Elijah is instructed that the Lord is about to pass by. Make sure you're in a place to experience it. So out of the rocky outcrop goes the prophet, standing there, and then begins a windstorm. God shows up in a windstorm, powerful. It's enough to split foundations, to crumble the solid footing. It's a windstorm like the one that cleaved the Red Sea in two, like the one that led the Hebrews to this same mountain once before. And yet, for all its meaning, God was not in the wind, we are told. And God will not be in the earthquake either. Or have any of you been in an earthquake before? It's a new kind of shaking, a different kind of shaking. It's terrifying, but also familiar. The first time the earth quaked in Scripture was in Exodus, when God gave the covenant, the law of Israel, atop this same very mountain. Wind and seismic waves rattle, the foundations shake once again, and we are told that God is not in either. And then a fire. And God will not be in that fire either. The effects of fire are surprisingly loud. It doesn't itself make noise, the fire, no, but in every movie about fighting fires, infernos, on the news, firefighters are always shouting in order to be heard. We don't hear the fire, but what the fire does to the world around it. The hot air roars as it whooshes going exceedingly fast. The pops and cracks are the sound of the internal structures failing under the thermal stress. Loud snaps that startle us, often resin pockets bursting. Wind, the shaking of earth, and the roaring fire, all three are deafening, all three are raging, and God is not in either, in any, and then silence. Sheer silence. You may remember it described in the King James Version. It records God's still small voice. Other versions of Scripture describe the silence as a sound all of its own. The Common English Bible, that we don't use often, but it tells us that the silence was thin. Elijah can endure the roaring wind, the sound of the earth shaking below him. The prophet stands still before the raging fire, but it's the silence. It's the silence that forces Elijah to cover his ears and face. The silence makes him retreat to safety. It's not the noise, but it's the absence. God was not in the wind or the earthquake or the fire, but here we find God in the absence of those things, in the silence. And then God asks a question. What are you doing here, Elijah? 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 What are you doing here? The question is an instruction in its own right, and no matter Elijah's reasons, if someone ever asks you, if God ever asks you, what are you doing here, Dave? What are you doing here, Steve? What are you doing here, Pat? There's only really one way to go. God says to them and says to us, go from here and return on your way. It's not judgment, but instruction. It's not condemnation, but a reminder. Everyone seeking to escape their grief gets asked the same question eventually and given the same instruction eventually. Everyone who is afraid of the world they no longer understand or perhaps not even want to inhabit will be asked the same question. And it always comes with the same instruction. Friends, remember that no one but God lives atop Mount Horeb. Horeb was not a part of the promised land. It's not where God has led us. High atop this mountain is not where God intends you and me, us, to live fruitfully. God tells Elijah to return on your way. Notice, Elijah, return on your way. As if to say that life is to be spent down there. Life is to be spent off this mountain. Life is found back on level ground, back in the places where we live and where we are known. In other words, friends, God sends Elijah back down the mountain and along the way to home. The losses will sting. The heart will break. You can expect doubts. And yet this is Elijah's way. The path God has sent this prophet on this path. It will only be made by walking. It will only be made as he comes down off of the mountain. And the same could be said for you too. The radical love of God embraces us through our loves and our losses, through our grief and our fears. And those are so more powerful reasons when you're off God's mountain and the Spirit comes along your way. Friends, here on this All Saints Sunday, grief can be a reminder of what has been lost and the world-rocking fear that comes about. But even in the midst of this service, we are reminded that here in this place we gather, but here in this place we do not live. We are sent back along your way. Back to a world, back to the healing of time, of people, of community, of place. Our hearts may be broken, and no one service or scripture will change that. But life along the way is where God has called us to live ourselves out. For the God that stays with us both atop the mountain, but convicts us back into the world.